Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to Wildcard MTG. Real quick, before we get into this deck tech, I want to thank you all so much for checking out the videos so far. I never expected to get that many views from these, so it's really awesome to see that people are watching and are interested in what I'm doing. So thank you so much for that. And just a real quick thing here, I'm going to be putting these out every 2 weeks now instead of every week. The workload between editing and putting and recording all this stuff together got to be a little bit too much with my hectic life schedule. So from now on, the videos will be going up every 2 weeks. I'm not sure on the day still. I'm kind of toying between either Monday and Thursday still, but you guys will see. I would like to try and keep it consistent so that way you can guarantee you'll know when something's up. But yeah, 2 weeks, I think that'll be a little bit better and it'll give me more time to edit a little bit better. And again, thank you so much for giving this channel a shot. It's a little passion project of mine. I love Magic and I love building decks, so I figured I would share my ways of building decks, whether it be budget focused or non-budget focused. If you have an idea for a deck, please let me know. I would love to do it and put it up on the channel. Tell a friend. Thank you so much, and let's get into this one. Hello and welcome to another edition of Wildcard MTG EDH Deck Techs. Let's get into this one. This was a request from a commenter on one of my videos. They requested to see Edward Kenway, so that's what we're going to build today. We're going to be going in a Pirates Vehicles direction. So with that, let's get into Edward Kenway. Edward Kenway is a 3 generic blue-black-red commander. He's a legendary creature, human assassin pirate. And his ability says, at the beginning of your end step, create a treasure token for each tapped assassin, pirate, and or vehicle you control. Whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, look at the top card of that player's library, then exile it face down. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the rulings of that ability thanks to Scryfall here. And it says, if a tapped permanent you control has more than one of the subtypes listed in Edward's first ability, count it only once when determining how many treasure tokens to create. So that means if we have a vehicle and we have another card that makes it an assassin, Edward Kenway is only going to care about one of those. So it's either going to be a vehicle or an assassin. It cannot be both, and you cannot get double triggers off of both of those. And Edward Kenway also says that if you leave the game, the cards remain exiled face down indefinitely. No player may look at them. So that's the cool thing about his second ability, is you can exile those cards for good. You get to choose whether or not you want to play them. The way that we've kind of built this deck is leaning into us not really playing those cards. We can, but that's not really how we built the deck. This is a very aggro, vehicle-centric deck. So that's kind of how we're going with this. So that's the rules text on Edward Kenway. Pretty simple, pretty straight to the point. We're going to be trying to turn stuff sideways, make a bunch of treasure tokens, and go from there. So let's get into the stats on this deck. Let's look through the drops and the mana value and everything going on in the deck. So in this deck, the average mana value is 1.92 with lands and 3.02 without lands, and the median mana value of our deck is 2 with lands and 3 without. The deck's total mana value is 190. So we're only running 3 1-drops in this deck. Pretty simple, not a lot of crazy stuff, and we have a 97.74% chance playing them on curve. That's if we draw them in our opening hand. Now the bulk of our deck is really at the 2-drop spot. I mean, if you look at the graph, it constitutes about 25% of our deck, I would say, the 2-drop slot. We're running 8 creatures, 4 sorceries, 2 instants, and 9 artifacts. And we have a 90.58% chance of playing these on curve. So the total overall mana value of our deck is in between the 2 and 3 drop spots, so we have a lot of leeway to play stuff. And now for our 3 drops, we're running 7 creatures, 1 sorcery, but it's an X spell, so it kind of doesn't count, 3 instants, and 5 artifacts. And we have a 78.5% chance of playing those on curve. which I don't think will really be an issue because a lot of this deck we're going to be playing a little bit above curve depending on how much treasure token generation we get. And for our 4-drops, we're playing 5 creatures, 1 sorcery, 1 instant, 6 artifacts, and 2 enchantments, and we have a 62.9% chance of playing those on curve. Now for our 5-drops, we have very little. We're not really going above that 2 to 3 threshold. There's very little after this. We have 2 creatures, 1 sorcery, 1 artifact, and 1 enchantment in the 5-drop slot. We have a 45.64% chance of playing them on curve. The big one here is our commander. He does cost a lot. That's the big thing we're going to get into at the end about the pros and cons of this deck. Him costing 5 mana is pretty steep, so it's going to be a lot of setup involved here. For 6-drop, we have just 1 creature, and we have a 31% chance of playing it on curve. And for 7-drop, we have 1 sorcery, and we have a 19.77% chance of playing it on curve. And if you look at our spread of mana and how we did everything in the deck, so 50% of our mana symbols are blue. So our blue mana production, we have about 56%. So we put a little bit more blue lands in instead of... but if you look at our mana production here in this little graph, you can see that we have an pretty much equal spread across. Like we have 50% mana production from our lands and 47 black mana production from our lands, but we only need 23 and 28%. So realistically, we could cut some of that red and black to put a little more blue in there, but I think we're okay in this deck. So let's get into the creatures we're going to be utilizing in this deck. We're going to be running 23 creatures in total, and here's the rundown of the creatures. We have Adewale, Breaker of Chains, Amphin Mutineer, Basim Ibn Ishaq, Breaches, Eager Pillager, Captain Lannery Storm, Captain Storm Cosmium Raider, Corsair Captain, Cutthroat Negotiator, Cyberdrive Awakener, Forerunner of the Coalition, Francisco Foul Marauder, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, Malcolm the Eyes, Merchant Raiders, Reckless Fireweaver, Roshan Hidden Magister, Siren Storm Tamer, Staunch Crewmate, Storm Fleet Sprinter, Timestream Navigator, Warkite Marauder, Zara Renegade Recruiter, and Zephyr Stinger. So if you notice in this list, we are running mostly pirates and vehicles for the commander. Now there are a few assassins, but mostly the cheaper ones because I was trying to keep this deck slightly budget. And honestly, outside of the commander, there's only one other card above $10 in this deck, and it's one of our win cons, which we'll get to later. So a lot of the pirates we're running generate treasures, and this is a pretty heavily treasure-focused deck, so we can kind of play into the second part of our commander's ability if we need to, but mostly we're going to be going for a more aggro approach and attacking with the vehicles and the pirates, not trying to cast other players' spells unless there's absolute bombs. Now I will say the upside of the commander's ability too, we can play lands off him, so if we happen to exile a land, that will help us too. So definitely always play the lands off that if you can. So some of the creatures and their synergies, you know, we have creatures like Breaches, Eager Pillager, Captain Lannery Storm, Corsair Captain, and Malcolm Keen Eyes, which all generate treasure tokens for us. Basim Ibn Ishaq is a card draw outlet for us for casting historic spells, which are legendaries and artifacts, so that's a good portion of what the deck is comprised of. While it may only trigger once per turn, that is totally fine. We still draw a card, we still put that +1/+1 counter on him, and he becomes unblockable, which is a really cool thing to have. Adewale, Breaker of Chains, lets us dig into our deck for any of the aforementioned card types in our deck. And he also lets us recast him from our graveyard for having a vehicle do combat damage to a player. And Roshan, Hidden Magister, lets our pirates become assassins in addition to their other types. And this also includes when we crew a vehicle to make it become a creature to attack. But don't forget the rules text that we mentioned earlier. You know, even though the vehicle may be an assassin as well, Edward Kenway only cares for one of those types per creature. Now the rest of our pirates have some utility within the deck. You know, you got Time Stream Navigator, which just gives us an extra turn if we need it. Siren Storm Tamer allows us to counter a spell on a body for just 1 blue mana. Zephyr Singer, which is a really cool card, it lets us convoke it out, and when we do, all the creatures that convoked it get a flying counter, which is really good evasion for those attacks that we want to get in on people to get those treasure tokens and to exile their cards. And finally, Zara Renegade Recruiter lets us steal a creature just for the combat phase, which can be extremely helpful, and we can do it from any player that we're attacking. Now, funny enough, the most important creatures in our deck aren't even pirates or assassins. How about that? You know, this deck runs a tried and true staple in artifact or non-creature spell decks. You have the Reckless Fireweaver. That thing pings opponents for 1 damage whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under our control or we play a non-creature spell. So, basically, all those treasure tokens we're going to be generating turn into shocks and eventually lightning bolts, you know, the more tapped creatures we can get. And the other creature is basically one of our win cons that I mentioned earlier. If we happen to have amassed enough treasures and we have vehicles on the battlefield, this card will end the game most likely. I'm not going to go too in-depth about it here, but we'll go through it with the win cons later in the video. This card can easily close out games. It combos really nicely with another card we'll get into in the artifacts section of this deck tech. And again, this is the technically second most expensive card in the deck, coming in at about $12, and that is Cyberdrive Awakener. So, the sorceries. We are only running 9 sorceries. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this deck is, well, I say unfortunately, but for me, this is fine. I run more targeted removal than I do anything else. So a lot of it is targeted removal. I did go with a board wipe in this deck, but it's because it plays into what we want to do and it generates treasures. And I actually really do like this board wipe in a lot of decks, but not every deck. If you do want to add one more to the deck, I would suggest Kindred Dominance. It's not in this list, but it does help because this is a Kindred deck, and if you want to save your own creatures, your own pirates, assassins, whatever, it's a good board wipe to have. But for this deck specifically, we are running Back in Town, Blood Money, Chart a Course, Eagle Vision, Feed the Swarm, Fell, March of the Drowned, Start Your Engines, and Walk the Plank. Now the targeted removal is mostly aimed at creature removal at sorcery speed, but it has a low mana value for the deck, so it's not ever going to cost us too much to get rid of a creature, which is good. And I mean, one of them is a new card, Fell from Bloomborough, and I think that card's pretty darn good for being sorcery speed, 2 mana, get rid of a creature, why not? Walk the Plank also serves that same purpose. Yes, it is double black pips, but we really shouldn't have any problem getting double black in this deck. Now, Feed the Swarm. Yes, you can use it to get rid of a problematic creature, but since black is so hard to... red and blue is pretty hard to come by with enchantment removal in general, you should save it for a problematic enchantment at your table, whether it be something crazy like a Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe or whatever, because we don't have a lot of enchantment removal, unfortunately, and this is the only card that can take care of it. Yes, we're going to lose life, but that's fine. Cards like Eagle Vision and Chart a Course let us draw cards. Back in Town and March of the Drowned gives graveyard recursion for our creatures. Back in Town specifically is really good for this deck and getting everything out of the graveyard because it only targets our exact creatures, which are also happen to be outlaws. Now, Start Your Engines is also a good way to get all of our vehicles online as creatures if we don't have enough to crew them, and that can be a good way to get in for some damage while kind of saving our creatures that we do have for a later turn. Typically, you don't want to use this card unless you have 4 or more vehicles because you're just not getting the rate. You know, you don't want to have 2 vehicles and then spend 3 mana and then your 2 vehicles kind of do nothing for a turn. You want to save it until you have quite a bit of them if you're able to. If you really are in a pinch and you need to use it, then use it. And of course, Blood Money is a board wipe that I mentioned earlier. It gets rid of all creatures, including ours, but we generate a ton of treasure for doing so. I mean, I really like this board wipe a lot, especially in this deck or any deck that's generating treasures. I run it in Prosper and a couple other treasure decks I have as well. It's a cool board wipe. So let's get into our instance here. We are running Bedevil, Big Score, Hornswoggle, Lookout's Dispersal, Reality Shift, and Terminate. Now, we are running a little bit lower amount of instants. We're only running 6 for removal. And if you're really not worried about budget, there's a ton of instant speed removal. You can switch in and out, get rid of some of the sorceries, put in the instants instead. But for this deck specifically, because we want to be a little more budget-minded for it, I went for a little bit less. But the good thing, you know, being a Grixis, you can run more counter spells if you want to do as well. I'm not much of a control player, so I really only opted for about 2 in this deck. We have Hornswoggle, which counters the spell, and we get a treasure token out of it. And then we have Lookout's Dispersal that lets us counter a spell for 1 generic less if we control a pirate, which we most likely will. It is a tax effect counter, but I doubt anyone's going to pay 4 mana extra just to not let something get countered. Or if we play it at the right time when they don't have the mana to pay for it, that will help as well. So pretty small instant package, not really too much, you know, the usual things here for Grixis removal, or targeted removal, I should say. Now, artifacts are a bulk of our deck because it is a vehicle deck and because we need mana rocks to ramp ourselves. So we're running 22 artifacts, and they are Adrestia, Arcane Signet, Careening Minecart, Deluxe Dragster, Encroaching Mycosynth, Horde Hauler, Jackdaw, Mech Titan Core, Mighty Servant of Luke O, Mizium Tank, Mobilizer Mech, Reckoner Bankbuster, RMS Titanic, Soul Ring, Subterranean Schooner, Surge Hacker Mech, Swiftfoot Boots, Talisman of Creativity, Talisman of Dominance, the Belligerent, the Indomitable, and Treasure Map. So a lot of our vehicles are really dependent on having multiple out on the field at the same time. You know, we want to be able to crew them if needed, so that's why we run a pretty equal number of creatures in ratio to the number of vehicles we have, and that's why there's so many in this deck. Now, the Adrestia is a new vehicle card from Assassin's Creed that actually cares about an assassin crewing it, which gives us card draw, and it makes the vehicle an assassin in addition to its other types, which our commander cares about. But again, remember, we're only going to get that 1 trigger off of it. The other good thing is most of our vehicle package only has a crew cost of 1, 2, or 3, which is really easy to do, which means you only need the total power equal to that number to crew them. Now, the other thing to remember as far as rules go is that vehicles are not creatures unless they are crewed, or another card specifically says that they don't need to be until the end of turn or something like that. So you cannot attack with a vehicle that's played the same turn unless it specifically says that it has haste. And it basically follows all the restrictions of a creature. You know, it has summoning sickness, basically. That's the way you should look at it. You can still crew a vehicle to block with it, if that makes sense. Vehicles are a little weird. I have a mutate vehicles deck, which is really awesome. The rules on that deck are kind of insane. You can pretty much make a... getting off on a tangent here, but you could pretty much make a vehicle a permanent object if you mutate on it while it's a creature. It's really interesting rule stuff. That's why I built the deck. I love mutate. So let's get into some of these big bomb vehicles. One of them is Horde Hauler, which is sort of a pseudo Dockside Extortionist. It says it's a 5/5 with Trample, and it says whenever Horde Hauler deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token for each artifact they control. So obviously you're going to want to swing in with this on the person with the most artifacts and make a bunch of treasure tokens yourself. That's why I say pseudo Dockside Extortionist, because you still have to make the combat damage happen, but because it says Trample, you can still probably get in with at least 1 damage and it'll be worth it. And our next one here is Mighty Servant of Luco. This card's really interesting. I like it in vehicle decks. I've been kind of putting it in all of them. It's 3 mana. It is Trample with Ward, discard a card. So they're going to have to, if they want to target it, they're going to have to discard a card. And it says whenever Mighty Servant of Luco becomes crewed for the first time each turn, if it was crewed by exactly 2 creatures, it gains. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw 2 cards. So this is one of the vehicles that has a higher crew cost than the rest. It's got 4, but it's still pretty easy to pull off, and drawing 2 cards to crew it with 2 creatures that have 4 enough to make 4 power, so it's just 2 2/2s. That's perfectly doable. And this thing's a 6/6 trampler for 3 mana. Pretty good vehicle in my opinion. And next up is the RMS Titanic. This is from the Doctor Who set. It's 4 mana flying trample with crew 3, and it says whenever RMS Titanic deals combat damage to players, sacrifice it and create that many treasure tokens. So there's a pretty good chance you can get in with this for just completely unblocked. You can get in it for all 7 damage, so in that case you're going to make 7 treasure tokens. On the off chance that somebody does block it, so what? You're still probably going to make at least 4 or 5, maybe, you know, at the low end, maybe 3. I don't see a world where you're going to be making 2 or 1 treasure tokens off this unless somebody is playing a flying deck and they triple block it or something some crazy outlier thing that may happen. I think this card's pretty cool. Pretty good card, I think, especially for vehicle decks. And treasure decks, if you want to run it in that too. And one of the coolest cards in this deck. It's one of my favorite little pet cards. I try to run I run it even outside of vehicle decks just because it's such a fun card to pull off if you can. And yes, it's somewhat janky, but that card is Mech Titan Core. Yes, that is the card that is basically Voltron and or Power Rangers depending on your age. And this card is 2 mana for a 2/4 with crew 2. And it says pay 5, exile Mech Titan Core and 4 other artifact creatures and or vehicles you control. Create Mech Titan, a legendary 10/10 construct artifact creature token with flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink, and haste that is all colors. Now here's the cool part. It says when that token leaves the battlefield, return all cards exiled with Mech Titan Core except Mech Titan Core to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control. So let's say we get to live the dream. Pay 5, exile Mech Titan Core and 4 other artifact creatures or vehicles. Doesn't matter, it could be a combo of both, as long as they're artifacts. And then bam, we get to make the thing. Now, if it's indestructible, so just doing a kill spell on it isn't going to do anything. If somebody has like a forced sacrifice thing and we happen to have to sacrifice it, that's fine. If it gets exiled, that's also fine. That's the thing about this, the little keyword here says when it leaves the battlefield. It doesn't care if it was killed, exiled, or sacrificed. You still get all your stuff back. So all the things that got exiled with it are going to come back into the battlefield. So if we have stuff that have ETB triggers, we're going to get all those again. Usually vehicles don't typically have those, so don't worry too much about that. But if our creatures have ETB effects, which I think there are a few pirates that do, that's a good way to do that. And, another little combo in this deck that I kind of mentioned earlier is Encroaching Mycosynth. Now, this card makes all of our non-land permanents artifacts in addition to their other types. So that means our creatures are now artifacts as well. So we can take those pirates and make them go into the Mech Titan Core since they're going to be an artifact creature. Now, there are downsides to this card, which I will get into in the pros and cons section of this, but for now, just kind of keep that in your head that Encroaching Mycosynth can facilitate us to do the badass Mech Titan Core thing. It's a little bit of a janky card, but it's super fun if you could pull it off, and I don't even think the cost is that high. Like a 7 mana investment for a 10/10 indestructible lifelink haste flying vigilance trample, dude. Yeah, it's not quite in a game ender, but it's a beater, that's for sure. And so let's go quickly to our enchantments here. We're only running 3 very small enchantments. We don't really need a lot of enchantments, this isn't really, it's more focused on artifacts. So we're running Coastal Piracy, Conspiracy, and Mechanized Production. So really we're running these for different things to facilitate in our deck. One of them is a win con. Mechanized Production. This is an enchant artifact you control. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of enchanted artifact. Then if you control 8 or more artifacts with the same name as one another, you win the game. So throw this on a treasure token, swing with 8 creatures, hope you make it to your next turn. Boom, win the game. We'll get into that in the win con section, but there it is. And finally, our land base. We are running 36 lands. A lot of non-basics, so let's get into them here. We have Archway of Innovation, Buried Ruin, Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, 6 Islands, Mech Hangar, Molten Tributary, 5 Mountains, Path of Ancestry, Rogue's Passage, Secluded Courtyard, Seething Landscape, Shivan Reef, Smoldering Marsh, Spire of Industry, Sulphur Falls, Sunken Hollow, 5 Swamps, Tainted Isle, Tainted Peak, Temple of the False God, the Mycosynth Gardens, and Unclaimed Territory. So pretty simple land package there. Nothing really crazy to really know about. Really only interesting thing is Archway of Innovation. The next spell you cast this turn has Improvise, so all your artifacts can help cast that spell. And since we are running a lot of artifacts, it makes sense in this deck. Mech Hangar, we can use it to have 1 mana of any color to cast a pilot or vehicle spell, but the thing is most vehicles are colorless. I think there's only like 2 or 3 that have a color in the deck. Spire of Industry, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any color, activate only if you control an artifact. Chances of us having artifact are pretty high, so it's good to color fix basically. And finally, the Mycosynth Gardens. It becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. So we can make this land become a copy of one of our vehicles that are non-legendary, then swing in with an extra vehicle. How cool is that? We still have to pay the mana cost for it, but it's totally worth it if we're trying to get in with an extra vehicle attack or get an extra trigger off one of our vehicles, something like that. Pretty cool land, definitely like it a lot. It's one of the more expensive cards in the deck, I guess, at around like $4, but definitely auto-include in this deck for sure. Now, before we talk about the win cons, let's discuss some of the pros and cons of the deck. Like usual, you need to know the upsides and the downsides of running this deck. Now, obviously being in Grixis leaves us without a lot of ramp options, so it could take a while to be able to cast some of the higher cost spells and our commander because he costs 5 mana. This is one of the cons of the deck. He's 5 mana. If he gets removed once or even twice, we could be out of luck. You know, it's not going to be good if he gets up and costs like 10 mana. It's going to be uncastable. That is one of the downsides of this deck, I think. Just the high cost of the commander. The upside, one of the upsides, I guess, is that the mana curve in this deck for everything else is pretty darn low, like I mentioned earlier. Everything's in the 2 to 3 mana range, so we should be able to get to a point where we can play multiple spells a turn. And we shouldn't have any problems playing the higher end of our deck once we get to making treasure tokens. Now the deck is also very aggro, and that is kind of an upside here. You know, we want to be attacking and tapping our creatures every turn we can because we want those triggers from our commander. Now some of the cons of that is because we are such an aggro deck, it does kind of leave us open for crackback if we're facing another aggro deck or somebody that has creatures. So really you want to attack accordingly to not accrue a ton of damage based off that. Now also, like I mentioned earlier, there is one card that plays into one win con we have that can also be a little bit of a detriment to the deck, and you have to be careful when playing it, and that was Encroaching Mycosynth. So like I mentioned, it makes everything in our deck, all of our non-land permanents anyways, artifacts in addition to their other types. But the downside is if somebody's running a lot of artifact removal or we get Vandal Blasted, that will wipe us out. I mean, done for. We're not going to be able to recover from that really unless we have that card that lets us get all of our creatures back out of our graveyard. But even then, it's very iffy, it's very situational. If you know that somebody's not running a lot of like artifact removal, you should be safe, should be fine, and that will help you get closer to winning with the deck. Speaking of that, how do we win with this deck? Well, there are 2 ways I mentioned, and we're going to break them down a little bit now. So one of them, as I mentioned earlier, since I already kind of went through it, is Mechanized Production. It's 4 mana, it's an enchantment, and you have to enchant an artifact you control. At the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to create a token that's a copy of that enchanted artifact, and if you control at least 8 of them with the same name, you win the game. So obviously you want to put this on something like your treasure tokens that you're going to be making a lot of. This is in the Deep Clue C deck as well, and I have seen my friend win with this card more times than I can count, and it's a great win con, especially if you know you're making a ton of a certain artifact like treasures. This thing will help you win. So keep that in mind. You don't want to attach it to like your soul ring, even though that would be funny to try and win with 8 soul rings. If you can pull it off of this deck, let me know, because that would be hilarious. But you want to do it with something you're generating a lot of, and treasure is what we're going to be generating, so trying to get this on a treasure token is going to be ideal. So that's one of our main win cons. Now the other one is on one of our creatures that I mentioned earlier that is not a pirate, and that is Cyberdrive Awakener. It's the second most expensive card in the deck. It's about $10.99. Depending on where you buy it, it's about between $7 and $10. Cyberdrive Awakener is 5 generic and 1 blue. It is a artifact creature construct. It is flying. It says other artifact creatures you control have flying. So again, this kind of plays into encroaching mycosynth. If everything is an artifact, then everything has flying, as long as it's a creature. But here's the other part about Cyberdrive Awakener. It says when it enters the battlefield, until end of turn, each non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/4. So we have, say, 10, 12 treasure tokens just sitting on the battlefield. This is pretty much a game ender, because they're all going to be 4/4s that are flying, and then you have to take into account if you happen to have the God Hand or whatever, and encroaching mycosynth is also out. All your other creatures are artifacts, and they're also flying, so you're going to have a ton of evasion to get in for lethal with this card. It's basically a Crater Hoof, sort of. The downside is you're not getting Trample, obviously, but the fact that you could animate all your treasure tokens or even your mana rocks, and they will become 4/4 creatures of flying. Oh, and guess what else? That also counts your vehicles. If your vehicles are not crewed, they are now 4/4 creatures with flying. So it could be a game ender in itself. This is the other card that we really need to keep alive. It will win the game for us. So keep that in mind. Cyberdrive Awakener. Really great card. I have it in my vehicles deck, and I also have it in my Jorah Weatherlight Captain deck. It's a good way to close out games for sure. So this is kind of a semi-budget Edward Kenway deck, thanks to the commenter who wanted me to kind of explore the deck for them, and I hope I did it sufficiently for you there and explained how you can win with this deck and the cool ways to play it. Now, it's very aggro, has tons of opportunity to generate treasures, where you can play into the second ability of the commander if you need to. So that is everything for Edward Kenway. I've been Wildcard MTG. Thank you so much for watching. If you have a deck tech that you would like to see, let me know in the comments, and I'll add it to the list, and I'll see you on the next one.